Talk about Jefferson and obviously his contradictions too with this. There he is, a slave owner, unrepentant slave owner in a way, and yet a dedicated reader of the Stoics. How did he wrestle with his own inconsistencies on all of this?
Well, we've got to talk about slavery, of course. And it's just striking how far from denying the inconsistency of slavery with natural law, Jefferson and the other enslavers acknowledged it and even recognized their own hypocrisy in moments of self-awareness. There's that amazing quotation from Patrick Henry, who Jefferson heard denounce the slavery of Britain in the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Patrick Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself believe slavery violates natural laws, but I own slaves. I will not justify it. I will not attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without slavery."
Okay, now let's take that, because that's a pretty staggering statement. It's I know I'm full of it, but I like it, and it's avarice, right? He names the vice. He knows what it is. He knows also it's about laziness and his own desire to have an easy life. And good God, they would have to work a lot harder without slaves. So, I mean, does that mean that in some ways these people talked a pretty good game? They were struggling with it. When you actually look at their lives, I think there were a few that obviously rose above, but so many of them didn't.
Yes, that puts it perfectly. And some really did rise above. George Wythe, Jefferson's favorite law professor, lived his principles, freed his enslaved population, and denounced slavery. Others were better than Jefferson. Washington freed his enslaved population on his death. Others grew. Franklin, who initially owned a slave, came to be freedom and became to be a great abolitionist. But it makes Jefferson's hypocrisy really more shocking. Both the degree of his racism, that's really the only word for it, disparaging the idea that Black people could even be as the intellectual equals of whites. He degrades the genius of Phyllis Wheatley and says that you can't have a good Black poet. And the fact that he's always, and then, of course, just the staggering truth that he's surrounded at Monticello, which he constructs as a kind of prelapsarian fantasy of liberty from the ancient Irish woads. He is surrounded by his own children, by Sally Hemings, and he pretends that they're his servants, and he calls them members of his family. The only people he frees on his death are either his own children or their relatives, keeping a promise that he'd made to Sally Hemings. She refuses. He's sleeping with her when she's 16 years old, and he's in his 40s, and in Paris they begin their sexual relationship. And she won't come back to America unless he promises to free their kids. And because the Somerset decision of Lord Mansfield would have ensured that she could have stayed in Britain and remained free. So he promises, and she comes home, and he does free two of his kids and a few other people, but that's it. And then the rest of his enslaved population has to be sold to pay his debts, and parents are separated from children because of his own avarice and greed. So it far from exonerating him, in some ways it indicts him even more for his own hypocrisy, always saying that slavery should end at some point in the distant future, but the future keeps receding in the distance.
What's strange about that, to me at least, is that the ancients had no problem with slavery. So the people they're reading are, by and large, completely familiar with slavery and utterly unconcerned by it. They regard it as simply a part of the world they live in. How do we read these ancient writers who clearly thought, and Aristotle thought, that slavery was actually completely defensible?
Aristotle thought it was completely defensible. Seneca thought it was not, and insisted that it was a violation of divine reason. This is the crucial point. This is a glorious philosophy of individual liberation. This is the core of modern individualism, and it became the core of liberalism. And the fact that some of the philosophers endorsed a widespread practice, whereas others felt that it was inconsistent with the ideals, doesn't in any way rebuke the fact that the ideals themselves are those of individual liberty, as Jefferson recognized when he channeled them in the glory.
Seneca challenged the existence of slavery in his own time.
He did, and thought that it was a violation of divine reason. And
because they are human beings who everyone has the same light within them to reason and to be part of God's universe.
Completely so. And the purpose of life is to live in accordance with reason, which requires the equal liberty with which we're all endowed by the Creator.